Today we're going to jump into Unit 6, Day 1 and talk about the Wild West. And I know I say it with a lot of historical periods, but I do love talking about the Wild West. Again, I just love U.S. history in general, and I get very excited about certain parts of it. And the Wild West and the American West is one of those things that I do get very excited about. Enjoy this beautiful image here from Yellowstone National Park. Again, absolutely beautiful. If you never had the chance to travel out west, I went when I was a kid. I'd love to go again now as an adult, but really it is very, very beautiful out there. So Frederick Jackson Turner, who wrote the Turner Thesis, this is a quote from him, and he says, "American social development has been continually beginning over again on the frontier. The perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, the expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating American character. The true point in the history of this nation is not the Atlantic coast, it is the Great West." And again, you're going to see throughout American history, that people really look to the American West. And really, when you talk about people from other countries, a lot of people still define Americans by the American West and the cowboys and that whole genre of film, like the American Western. That's how a lot of other countries look at us. So I would encourage you to think about what words you would use when thinking about the American West and how you would describe the American West and what pops into your head, because you're going to see that's how a lot of other people from other countries view us here in the United States. Got a scene here for you to watch from the original Magnificent Seven movie. This is going to be a standoff that's going to happen. And I want you to look at this scene and think about how this reflects our perceptions of the West. And when you see movies, movies about the Wild West aren't as popular as they were in like the 50s and 60s. But you are going to see that a lot of perceptions of the West are shaped by Hollywood and this time in American history here. So, move west. Horace Greeley had described the plains in 1859 as basically a place you did not want to go. The plains were being known for being very dry, with short grass. Prior to 1860, it was known as the Great American Desert. And the effect of these thoughts would be that people didn't see a reason to go out west, and they didn't want to go out west because who wants to move to the middle of a desert? During this time, you can see there on the map, you have 100,000 Indians from 30 different tribal groups live on the Great Plains. They are listed there, different tribes that live out there. You are going to see some of the tribes, such as the Sioux, were extremely proficient with guns and were very, very skillful horse riders. The U.S. military would find that out, certainly in some of the Indian wars that we would fight out in the West. So, point is, you have a lot of Native Americans are out in the West. In 1834, American designated the Great Plains Indian country. Again, looking at it, a lot of people felt like the land was very, very poor quality, and so they give the land to the Indians. The Army bordered that territory with forts, and trade was monitored with whites. And that's why you see a lot of times when you are watching like old Westerns and talking about the Old West, usually there's going to be a U.S. military presence out there. And again, a lot of this goes back to this time of the U.S. military was out there already, had forts to kind of watch over the Indians. So why did Americans become interested in the Great Plains beginning in the mid-19th century? Again, Americans start to see the value of moving out west, but maybe not necessarily moving into the Great Plains, but as a alleyway to the west into the Pacific coast there. So, like I said, the Midwest and the Great Plains becomes the bridge to the Pacific. We've already talked about the Oregon Trail. That, along with other trails, cut through the Great Plains, and soon you're going to realize railroads, telegraph lines, freight lines, Pony Express, all that started to be plotted through the plains. So now this land that had originally been given to the Indians was supposed to be theirs. Americans start to use that land in our drive to get out west. Land grants. The government, we talked about the Homestead Act, but you would see the government encourages companies to go out there by giving land grants to railroads, and so that they can build railroads and telegraph lines in the West. Think about, again, building railroads. We've kind of mentioned it in passing before, but the Transcontinental Railroad, that comes up several times now, looking for a route to take that through. As I just mentioned, Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific, Central Pacific Railroads had worked throughout the Civil War on the Transcontinental Railroad. Of course, they would have to cross through the Great Plains in this Indian territory. The Transcontinental Railroad would be finished in 1869. They would meet at Promontory Point in Utah. No other railroads had made it as far as the Rockies before the Pacific Railroad had failed. So again, this is going to be this first Transcontinental Railroad making it through the Rocky Mountains there. By 1878, economic recovery had taken hold, and during the 1880s, you're going to see 40,000 miles of track had been laid west of the Mississippi River. So really, you're going to see this explosion in railroads during this time. Cattle. Cattle raising had become a very attractive form of farming in the West. By the 1860s, there are going to be wild herds of 15 million cattle in the West. Buffalo had to be removed from the land first. There had been about 15 million on the plains. How was this done? Obviously, they would go out there and just kill the buffalo. A lot of times they would use the hides and that kind of stuff. That picture that you see at the top there, that guy is actually standing on a mound of buffalo skulls. And you're going to see by the end of this time that buffalo had pretty much completely been eradicated from the West. This would be negative for the Native Americans because Native Americans still depended on the buffalo for a lot of different things. So by eliminating the buffalo, that would be negative for them. Now, looking forward to today, you're going to see the government has done a lot to rehabilitate the buffalo population out in the West, and it's probably stronger than it had been in a very, very long time. But really, the focus becomes on cattle and raising cattle in the West. So how did the Wild West get this perception of the Wild West? You're going to see in Texas towns and in towns throughout all of the West, Abilene, Ellsworth, Dodge City, ranchers would sell their cattle and then go on binges. Usually what you would do is you'd go to these towns that would be these central hubs, bring the cattle to market, which was known as the long drive over this unfenced land. And the people that were leading these became known as cowboys because they are leading the cowboys. They would go to these towns and then they would basically party it up when they got to the towns. And that's how you get this image of this Wild West because people are going to saloons and bars in these towns where you would have brothels and all kinds of stuff. Very, very wild stuff happening in these towns. Now, one disservice that Hollywood did throughout the 50s and 60s, again, not a lot of Native Americans in acting during that time. Actually, very, very few were. And a lot of people get the perception of cowboys purely being white men during this time. And you're going to see you're actually going to have a lot of African-American cowboys and Hispanics working as cowboys, but also working as farm hands during this time. But again, this challenges our perception because you do have a lot of African-American cowboys that are there in the West working side by side with white men. And hopefully in the future, when Hollywood makes films that represent the West, they do a better representation of the Wild West having not just white people, but also African-American cowboys there as well. Another reason why you're going to see this perception of the Wild West is because of the media during the time. In the newspapers, you're going to have events such as the shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. That helped contribute to that idea, and you're going to see that Hollywood really focuses on this. When I was growing up in the 90s, you'd have two movies that came out pretty much right back to back. One, the movie Wyatt Earp, and then the other movie Tombstone, both about revolving around the life of Wyatt Earp and the shootout at the OK Corral. In this shootout, I've included a scene there from a movie showing a little bit. I think it's from the movie Wyatt Earp. This gunfight would see lawman Virgil Earp, basically the Earps and Doc Holliday confronting outlaw cowboys and three of the outlaws being killed. Again, these news stories are going to run in the paper. People are going to hear about it. And again, it's going to shape people's perception of the West and what the West was like. And I'm not saying the West wasn't wild during this time because it certainly was. Go back and check out or read some of the stories about things that were happening out there. And oftentimes you're going to see in the West, it was kind of this like fine line between an outlaw and a lawman. A lot of times they kind of towed the line as far as that was. Some people believe that even about Wyatt Earp, who you can see pictured there. Wyatt Earp, both of his brothers would eventually be killed and shot as a result of things, and Wyatt Earp would eventually just leave Tombstone, Arizona, and move to California. So land in the West. Texas ranchers owned or leased the land that they used, sometimes in large tracts. You'll see in North Texas, land was the public domain, and cattlemen took land as they wanted. Usually ranchers would find land that they took. They would claim that under the federal homesteading laws, and it would become theirs. Again, the West becomes very, very attractive because of easy money, free grass, growing rail connections. And again, a lot of Americans had just this excitement of moving out West. And you still see that excitement today, that you have people that are excited to go to California and kind of create their own life and their own persona out there. And that's what really gets started during this time. In 1885, you're going to see that you have this move towards the end of open ranching. You're going to have hard winter followed by severe droughts and then blizzards. and lead to the death of thousands of cattle. The market was then flooded with cattle, which would lead to a decrease in prices because of all the cattle dying and then them taking that land out west. Ranchers start to begin to fence lands and plant hay. And basically, you're going to see that the Wild West, in a sense, is tamed, at least this era of open ranching. The big thing that would help with that is the barbed wire, which we'll talk more about that. The advent of the barbed wire is really going to have a huge effect on the West, because now you didn't have to worry about having cowboys constantly focusing on keeping the cows where they needed to be. You had barbed wire, which would keep them in fence to a point. Again, another way that you're going to see us get this perception of the Wild West is because of Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. William F. Cody, who had been an ex-guerrilla fighter, was known for his crack shot, and he got the nickname Buffalo Bill. In 1868, an Indian War would break out. Cody becomes known as a very, very good Army scout, and a novelist would write about him and writes the book Buffalo Bill, the King of the Bordermen. Cody would turn this popularity into a New York stage show, and it was known as, of course, his Wild West show. Actually, in the Sioux Wars that you would have later on, Cody would ride in the battle into the outfit he actually performed in during this time. Again, another thing lending to that perception of what the Wild West would look like during that time. So again, lots of things are going to shape people's influence of this. Homesteaders. How were settlers convinced to migrate to the Great Plains? Railroads began selling off public land that had been granted, usually at excellent prices. So that means that more land is going to become available. We talked about the Homestead Act in the previous unit, how that encouraged people to move out west because now they were given free land. They just had to work it. And after a period of 5 years, it was theirs. Now, land, this life out there, not very, very easy. Again, very dependent upon the climate and what was happening. But again, a lot of people viewed it as a new start and a new opportunity, especially in the wake of the Civil War. Gender roles on the plains, you're going to see that in the West, again, it's almost like an equalization of the gender. Women and men were both working together out on the farms. Women a lot of times didn't have a choice because their husband would die or he would just give up. So you're going to see this like equalization of men and women on there, as oftentimes they are working together. Now, women were seen as having to take care of the family in a lot of ways still. So that would still happen there. Like I said, a lot of people decide they want to go west. You get this Western fever. Norwegians and Swedes start to immigrate into droves in the United States. A lot of them would settle in Minnesota and in the Dakota. As I said, you did have a lot of African Americans move out west. The Exodusters, which were African Americans that move from the South out to Kansas to create a new life for themselves. You could say that some of them just want to escape the post-Reconstruction South. Some of them want the opportunity to be able to farm their own land and make a life for themselves. Innovations would drive the way as far as this would go. John Deere steel plow would allow settlers to tame the land. Joseph Glidden, we mentioned the advent of barbed wire. Barbed wire allowed for cheap fencing for cattle. Hard kernel wheat would be imported in from Russia, which was tolerant to some of the extremes in weather that you had out in the West. Now, problems homesteaders would encounter. Semi-arid climate meant climate changes frequently, and that would be very difficult. I mentioned that you had climate change all over the place. That expresses word in the PowerPoint. I'll change that, but that shouldn't be in there. You had lack of water reserves needed for irrigation, so dry farming was used to bring subsoil moisture to the roots. Again, though, that required a whole lot of work. Eventually, you're going to see the movement to create dams and irrigation to help provide water for crops. And really, this area, now that we know it is fed by a underground aquifer, and a lot of people are able to eventually tap into that to get water. But again, that would be an issue, is the climate out there. Now, one of the things that I want you to think about, because this is something that for me, I didn't really think about very often either, is the dependence on the Eastern Industrial Revolution. We tend to think of, and when we view what we consider the Wild West, we tend to think of it and the Industrial Revolution as being separate. I know growing up, I always thought of like, oh, the Wild West, something happened like before the Civil War, and we think of it much earlier than what it was. But you need to understand is that what was happening in the West was directly related to the Industrial Revolution that is happening in the East. Again, you have railroads. Chicago was the nerve center of the Great Plains. A lot of these cattle would go back to Chicago to be processed and then sold. Eastern capital for financing. depending on eastern banks. Technology needed for dry farming coming from the East Coast. Packing houses on the East Coast. Building supplies, firearms. All of these things are coming from the industrial East to the Wild West. So again, that kind of messes with our view of the Wild West, this whole idea of independence and doing it all on your own. Well, no, the Wild West was very dependent upon what was happening in the East. Again, I have a picture there of the Sears Roebuck and Company catalog. And with that, you're going to see a lot of people out west were buying from that catalog to get things that they needed, such as guns and farming equipment and that kind of thing. I want to show you here, both of these guns here are identified with the Wild West. You'd have the Winchester 1873, which is a lever action rifle called the gun that won the West. You'd have this Colt revolver, which is known as the Peacemaker, the six shooter, the Frontier model. These guns are commonly used out west and seen as guns that helped win the American West. But then look at where they're produced. Both of them are produced in Connecticut on the East Coast. So again, make that connection. When you're thinking about the Wild West, think about what was happening out in the East that is allowing the Wild West to occur. Now, with this too, you're going to see some movements as you have more and more farmers popping out west. You're going to see some movement towards farmers and how farmers can work together. In 1867, you see Oliver Kelly. He would found the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry. Again, that's a long name. They were shortened down and just called the Grange Movement. What they did is provided places and social activities for farmers, cooperative programs with bulk purchasing for farmers, again, to help make things cheaper, banks, insurance companies, and manufacturing. And basically, this was farmers working together to try to make things more efficient for themselves, but also to help get the best prices for their crops. You'll see that many of these ventures would fail, but a lot of farmers continue to embrace the movement, like Montgomery Ward. The Grange also would lobby the government to do a lot of different things, like laws regulating grain elevators, fixing railroad rates, and prohibiting discrimination of small shippers. So the Grange is really this first time that you're going to see farmers work together on a large scale. Now, what about Indians? Of course, Indians would resist the efforts to take their land. In 1867, you would see treaties signed to set up to end fighting and set up reservations for the Indians. South Dakota and Oklahoma both set up as Indian reservations. You're going to still see that you're going to have a lot of Native Americans that continue to resist efforts, most notably in Kansas and Texas and in the Dakotas as well. If you see this map here, this shows the battle between Indians and the U.S. Army, all these battles that would happen out there. So the Native Americans, again, still very hostile to losing their land. Famous Indian resistance you would have happen during this time. You'd have Apaches in the Southwest led by the Indian Geronimo, who would harass white settlers. Geronimo, he would end up being captured in 1886. In 1875, you would have the Office of Indian Affairs ordered the Sioux Indians to vacate the Powder River grounds and reservations in the Northern Plains. In response to that, the military would send out, or the federal government would send out the military. Sitting Bull, who was out there, he would lead the Sioux and the Cheyenne Warrior on the Little Bighorn River there and basically make their stand against the federal government. General George Custer, who had achieved fame during the Civil War, he would be sent out there. He would come upon a Sioux encampment. He was told when approaching that not to engage, not to try to fight against that, but he let his ego get a little bit a hold of him, and he decides to attack. He does attack, and you're going to see that Custer and his 256 men are going to be killed by Crazy Horse's warriors out there, and what's known as his last stand there, Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn. Again, probably the most famous example of the Indians being successful in fighting back against the federal government. Now, after this, again, Custer was defeated. His small force was, but still you had the whole federal army that could be sent out there. So eventually the Sioux bands would give up. The last to surrender would actually be Sitting Bull and his warriors. So what reservation? So by the mid-1870s, you're going to see prospectors begin to dig for gold in the Black Hills of Dakota reservation. Once you start to find gold, oil, other things out there, the government responds by opening up the land and saying, hey, prospectors, you can go out there. And eventually Indians are once again forced to move. The Boomer movement pushes for fertile land in Oklahoma to be taken away from the Indians, and the government would eventually do that as well. Again, the Black Hills of Dakota is where you're going to have Mount Rushmore at today. Now, the question as far as what to do with the Indians, you're going to have the Dawes Severalty Act passed in 1887. The 1870s, the Office of Indian Affairs develops a program to train Indian children for farm work and to prepare them for citizenship. So remember we talked about before how with Native Americans, this was view of basically civilizing African Americans or protecting African Americans. Helen Hunt's book, A Century of Dishonor, told of the unjustment of Indians and pushed for reforms in American government's policy towards Indians. Her book, though, would unintentionally generate support for ending Indian culture through assimilation. And that is what the Dawes Severalty Act is going to do. It's going to basically take Indians' lands, split them up into smaller areas, and then redistribute that land for families. And the reason the federal government wanted to do this is instead of Indians looking as living on a reservation altogether and commonly sharing land, it was seen as if we split up the land, that's going to force the Indians basically to kind of take on American culture, which is you have your own land. Everybody, you don't share land among everybody. It's split up and subdivided. And again, this was seen as a way of attacking and getting rid of that Indian culture. Other lands would be sold off and used for education. And you can see here a poster for this Indian land for sale. Also during this time, you would have the Wounded Knee Massacre, where Sioux Indians would be immediately affected by the Dawes Act. The federal government opens up surplus Sioux lands without surveying the land. The Wovoka pushes for the Sioux to practice the ghost dance with the goal of disappearance of the white man. And again, another terrible government massacre in U.S. history. December 1890, you're going to have U.S. troops kill 146 men, women, and children at Wounded Knee Creek. And this effectively would end any Indian resistance to the taking of tribal land when the government does this and goes in and kill. Now you're going to see the far west of the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Mountains lies what is considered the far west, basically that area between the Sierra Nevada and the Pacific Ocean. California had been considered very hilly and mountainous and not susceptible of supporting a very large population. By 1860, though, California was booming with a population of over 300,000. And by the mid-1850s, many of California gold miners had left chasing gold in Nevada, South Carolina, South Dakota, and Idaho. And you're going to see these boom towns pop up overnight, Virginia City, Nevada, and these places as people move farther out west into these areas that they hadn't wanted to go to before. The Pacific coast here, Oregon and Washington, these areas grew as a result of timber and produce market, and you're going to have some important commercial centers like Seattle and Portland as they are on bodies of water or on the ocean there as very important transportation centers and trade in the Pacific Ocean. Now, immigrants, you're going to see you do have a lot of Hispanics that come into the country who often settle in the areas close to Mexico. They often did such things as cattle and sheep ranching. You would have conflicts between whites and Hispanics over land rights in these areas, and often, again, pitted these poor ranchers against the wealthy. Mexicans would come over as contract workers for railroads and harvest crews. So you are having immigrants come in from Mexico, which does generate some conflict, but they were coming here for opportunity as well. You do have Chinese immigrants coming as well, Chinese flooding into California, initially attracted by the gold rush. This would start a movement of Asian migration throughout the world. Chinese immigrants would enter and work through 6 companies. And you're going to see that Chinese immigrants are actually going to be very influential in building the Transcontinental Railroad. That's one thing that actually Hollywood has done well is in movies reflecting Chinese being here to help on the workforce of the Transcontinental Railroad. In fact, they made up 4/5 of it. In response to that, you're going to see a lot of anti-Chinese movement here on the West Coast. Racism was directed at the Chinese because they were viewed as stealing jobs. 1870, San Francisco mobs threatened to burn docks from which Chinese enter the country. And that is going to get a response from the U.S. government with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which bars the entry of Chinese laborers into the country. You would see that American-born Chinese would find ways around the law by sneaking their family into the country, but the law would still be effective of slowing down Chinese immigration. And if you look at this picture here, it's represented as the Chinese man is trying to steal the meal there from the white family. Golden California. Again, as I have said earlier, you're going to see California and the West very, very unique. It is seen as Golden California. Again, people looked at it as like, oh, I can go into California and there's all kinds of new opportunities for me there financially and as a person. You would see a price war between two railroads, which effectively reduced the fare to be able to travel out to California, which pushed people to go out there. Wheat farmers start to convert into specialty crops, such as like oranges, almonds, raisins, and grapes, which are still grown and produced in big numbers there in California. Now, John Muir, in 1864, you can see Americans had pushed Congress to grant the state of California the Yosemite Valley to be preserved. John Muir, he would go out there and explore Yosemite and states that it was a result of glacial action. And you're going to see through John Muir and his photography, which that first picture I showed in this presentation is one of his pictures, would result in the creation of California's national parks. In 1892, you would have the Sierra Club formed to defend the California wilderness. There would be an aqueduct built through to help provide water for LA. And this valley that's pictured down here in the bottom would be completely flooded out to help provide in this aqueduct. But you're going to see through John Muir's actions, he is going to help get the government to help protect and defend some of this land. And then later on, Teddy Roosevelt will really push that to the next level. But there were some people out there who did want to conserve the land. And you can see even today that California has a ton of national and state parks and national forests there, land that is protected either by the state government or by the federal government. So your activity for today is going to be look at some primary sources and answer questions based on them. And really the big thing that I wanted you to get from today is we have this image of the Wild West, and the Wild West was very crazy. But keep in mind what happened in the West was enabled by what was happening in the East during that time. The cowboys and their guns, they wouldn't have their guns if it weren't for factories in Connecticut that were producing those guns. I don't know about you, but I'm excited now to go watch an old Western because I love talking about the West so much. So hope you have a great day. Go West, young man. Go West.